China is preparing to invade Taiwan. That is the statement Taiwan's deputy foreign minister recently gave Sky News when asked about the threat of the People's Liberation Army. And with military drills, naval face-offs, and exchanging blows, it appears a war is on the horizon. After all, Chinese President Xi Jinping threatened, no one can stop the reunification of the mainland with Taiwan. But will this war of words and military posturing transpire into a war? And how might the PLA conduct this audacious invasion?
Well, generally, we talk about a thing called the Davidson window, which comes from Admiral Davidson, who was the head of US PACOM, Pacific Command, one of the combatant commands of America. And the Davidson window says that Chinese capability will be there by 2027. And that, in military capability terms, is when the Chinese conduct an invasion and would hope to be successful. Now, of course, since he said that, which was about 7 or 8 years ago, a number of things have changed in terms of both the development of Chinese capability and indeed sort of notions of deterrence. And partly this has been influenced also by Ukraine. So, for example, the lessons of Ukraine for China is that you need to strike fast, don't fight unsure wars, and don't fight unprepared wars. So the Chinese are trying to shrink the strategic, operational, and tactical warning and act quickly. And the reason they would do that for an invasion is amphibious operations are some of the most complex operations that you could conduct. And the piece of water we're talking about across the Taiwan Strait is something like 100 to 120 miles, depending where you're going. And to get across that stretch of water, of course, you would need a number of precursor operations. To shrink that strategic space, they would try and make sure that the indicators and warnings are not there for America, Japan, and those other interested countries in the defense of Taiwan. So could they do it in military sense at the moment? I don't think they could. But deterrence is either by denial or punishment, and there is always that uncertainty of what that looks like from the American space when you have this muscular transactionalism from President Trump. So there is an uncertainty in all of that, and indeed that was exacerbated, one might say, in the last few weeks when Wang Yi, the foreign minister of China, said that they don't want, for example, to see Russia lose against Ukraine, because that would enable America to have their sole strategic focus on China and Taiwan. And indeed, for America, China is seen as the top pacing challenge and the near peer competitor, which they would have to deal with in the future. So anything which complicates decision making for America with eyes elsewhere around the world can potentially help China. There's a number of key determinants that you need to make an amphibious operation successful. Firstly, it ultimately depends on the success of land forces. So it'll be looking at the convoys going towards the amphibious or the loading areas in the Chinese ports. The second one, if you're going to be successful with a land invasion and amphibious operations, you must be got there by the Navy and sustained. So it's seeing the indicators of the Navy, the Chinese Navy coming together and being at combat readiness. Now, all that should be evident by either signals intelligence or human intelligence. And you cannot do any of that unless your Air Force can mean that you can operate successfully under their umbrella. So I think the first thing would be a normalization or a further normalization of the crossing of the median line. Now, the median line is essentially a line which bisects the Strait of Taiwan and is the tacit restraint line. So what the Chinese would seek to do, I think, prior to an invasion, over a number of months, would probably to keep on transgressing that line, and that line effectively is what triggers the decision point for the combat aircraft of Taiwan to come out to make sure that that line is not being crossed. It's the no crossing line. That would be one indicator. So if you wrap that all up together, those would be the indicators. But before you can even get to invade, there are a number of these complex operations which you would need to do. You would need to do a significant anti-submarine operation, because one or two or three submarines in that strait from either the Americans, Taiwan, whoever it might be, Japan, could start to devastate the invasion fleet. Secondly, you would need to do a significant anti-mining operation. There were probably something like 60 plus mine countermeasures vehicles from the countermeasure vessels from the Chinese, and that would be to deal with what we often call the porcupine defense of the Chinese, which is sea denial by bristling with a large number of small things that might be anti-ship missiles, and protective mining to delay, disrupt, and ultimately destroy the Chinese invasion fleet by a vertical curtain of mines, both from the bottom, moored contact mines, moored influence mines, and that would shape these maritime mobility corridors that I talked about for kill zones for anti-ship ballistic missiles. So there's no way, really, although they seek to shrink this strategic, operational, and tactical warning and act quickly, as I said, that you can actually do that in time and space, because you have those complex operations which do take time, rather like, for example, Normandy or whatever in 1944. You have to do these things before you can get ashore to enable you to have any chance of success. But I think the interesting thing is when this has been war gamed in the past few years, the outcome of that, although we have to be careful of this because, of course, you always set the parameters of the war game from your own side, is that the US and Taiwan can defend Taiwan successfully, but that all sides pay a heavy price. And the heavy price was that although China managed to get a foothold, for example, in the south and southwest, their resupply fleet was absolutely decimated, and therefore you wither on the vine and die, allowing the combat power and missile power of the Americans and the Japanese to be brought to bear to ensure that this wasn't a success from a Chinese side. If that happened, because of course the People's Liberation Army is really just the arm wing of the Chinese Communist Party, that would cause societal problems for Xi. And indeed, the caveat in a way is that I always quote the historian of my youth, A.J.P. Taylor, that nothing is inevitable until it happens. And so an invasion isn't inevitable, because one of the things about war is it is the most complex activity going. Amphibious operations are amongst the most complex of those activities from the warfare perspective within war. And although you want to be certain of the outcome before it starts, nothing is really certain in war. The only thing which would worry me tactically in terms of the tactical shrinking is that the Chinese fishing fleet is really just another arm of the People's Liberation Army. And if each of those parts of the fishing fleet, and there's significant thousands of these, were each to have a few drones, and you had a drone swarm towards Taiwan, whether you could do such significant damage that the thing would quickly be over. And this is part again of this gaming by the Chinese, that their lesson really from Ukraine is that you need to win, and you need to win quickly, and it's looking towards that. But I think again another indicator and warning from the American perspective and Taiwan perspective is where are the constituent parts of the Chinese fishing fleet. And again, we talk these days about 5 domains of war. That will be looked at through satellite power as much as anything else. And the greatest satellite power at the moment is the Chinese. But the Chinese are using AI in a way which could mean that although we talk about this near peer competitor from an American side, there are untried and unknown things about the PLA that may catch us out if we're not careful in the future. Well, you never want to fight a war by yourself, and it's at what stage and how early do the Americans and other allies come into play? Because again, the Chinese would seek to make sure that they've got a hard block against, for example, Japanese combat power coming to bear. So I don't think you can just see this thing in isolation by the Taiwanese on their own. So I think there are these triggers by the indicators and warnings which would bring an early decision from the Americans and Japanese to aid the Taiwanese. So I don't think you can separate Taiwan itself, unless again the Chinese were to try and have a diplomatic method to try and disconnect the Japanese and the Americans from that part of the world, by trying to sort of, I don't know, buy politicians in America. That there's no economic value to Taiwan, particularly if over a number of years President Trump, for example, were to restore the sovereignty, as it were, of chip making to America. But that again is not this decade's sort of problem because of the complexity and length of time it takes to gather or build that sort of capability in sovereign continental USA. Well, China's aim is actually wider than just Taiwan. Of course, it's a regional hegemony to begin with within Asia, and then its global preeminence. And the quickest way to do that from their perspective would be for the Chinese currency to supplant the dollar. If the dollar were not to be the reserve currency in the future, then America could quickly be seen to be an economic backwater. Do I think that's going to happen? No, I don't. But the first consequence, of course, is that the Strait of Taiwan is a global choke point. And indeed, if you had two P5 members, that's permanent members of the UN Security Council, engaged in fighting against each other, that could be a significant thing affecting global prosperity. We haven't really seen that really since the Second World War. Indeed, it was the miscalculation of the Americans thinking that the Chinese didn't have a influence in North Korea, which effectively stopped the Americans going as far north as they did, which is why we have the armistice on the 53rd parallel today. And again, until you've got that problem for the Chinese of how do they get around the predominance of the US military, then we still have this uncertainty of how the Chinese will react. If you can get over that by a diplomatic uncertainty, then you've got another problem. But what more profoundly, I think, China seeks to do is not just that sort of global preeminence, but it is that sort of current alliance between what we generally call the CRINC countries of China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, the sort of global agglomeration of dictatorships. That's becoming in the ascendancy would be significant unless there was a pushback from the democratic West, as it were.